Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hey everyone, welcome to today's podcast episode. Thank you so much for being here, whether it's your first time listening or you're returning. I'm excited that today's topic sparked your attention. It seems at first like kind of a subtle idea, but I think you'll hear how it can be a really powerful thread to kind of pull on that can unravel some really interesting insights in our practice. I don't have too many updates for you today before we go into the topic. It's a sunny spring day here, which is really lovely. It hasn't really warmed up that much yet, but we're kind of looking forward to summer. Mustache, the kitty, is asleep under the bed at the moment. Mike, the husband, is working in the next room. And I am cooking a few new offerings that I'm not quite ready to reveal to you yet, but I can tell you that my next live stream class series will be starting in a couple of weeks on May 19th. And it'll be an 8-week class series called Freeing the Breath Through Movement. It's like my weekly yoga class, but it's in an 8-week container where we focus on something specific. And in this case, it's all about combining breath explorations and moving into some formal pranayama practices and gentle but active yoga to kind of help us take a deeper look and get to know how we breathe. And then there is also my level 2 Yin Yoga training, which is coming up starting on June 11th. It's online. It's spread out over the summer with 4 live Zoom meetings. And we will be focusing on the 5 elements of nature, also breathwork, meditation, and sequencing all of this with the Yin poses in order to harmonize with the seasons. So there's more on both of those, just mentioning them briefly here, but there's more on my website, the class series and the Yin training and everything else I'm doing. And you can just find all that info at movedtomeditate.yoga if you would like to be in touch or practice a little bit more together. So on that note, why today's episode on observation mode and enhancement mode? And yes, I will explain what I even mean by that. For me, as someone who practices and teaches both yoga, mindful movement practices, and mindfulness meditation, I'm always really interested in how these different contemplative activities overlap and cross over, and also how they differ and offer us different benefits and different learnings, and what can we really glean from each. And how do they work differently? So one of the places that I like to explore this is by noticing how I tend to use my attention in different kinds of practice. So I'm going to talk about playing with modes of attention. I call them modes of attention in breathing, also in active yoga poses and in yin yoga poses, because they each give us a kind of a cool window into this mindfulness skill. It relates to how we work with concepts of alignment in yoga poses, what we even think of when we say alignment, and what it means to deepen the practice, which is often a controversial topic. It's really interesting how that can be a controversial topic, but people mean different things by that. So this idea of paying attention to attention might sound kind of subtle, but it's really interesting when you start to see how attention and intention lead to actions and efforts in your practice. And a lot of times that's pretty unconscious. So what I'm suggesting is that we make it conscious, and it'll start to make sense how sometimes the growth or depth in our practice can come more from how we are practicing than exactly what we are practicing. Like in yoga terms, it doesn't necessarily matter what poses we're doing, although many times in yoga, people think that they need to do more physically challenging poses, like the inversions and arm balances and the big deep back bends in order to, quote, deepen their practice. However, for those of us that define depth in practice as having more to do with strengthening our awareness, understanding our habit patterns, living less from judgment or anxiety, and cultivating kindness, things like that, we're going to want to pay attention to how we pay attention. One of the ways that we can explore this in practice is by distinguishing between these modes of observation and enhancement. So being in observation mode or being in enhancement mode when we're practicing, or you might call them modes of receptivity versus deliberateness, or a mode of being passive versus inactive engagement. So I'll say right away that one is not better than the other, but I do find it really helpful to be aware of when and how I'm using each of these modes. These two modes of observation and enhancement, or passive versus active engagement, however you want to call it, they certainly apply in our meditation practice, and also they apply in our asana or postural yoga practice and how we apply alignment and technique. But perhaps the clearest and easiest place to see this and start working with it in these different modes is in looking at how we're relating to the breath. So I think that I first heard these terms enhancement breathing and observation breathing used by Sarah Powers, who's one of the founders of the Yin Yoga style, just in a talk on her website years ago. And I probably could never find it for you again, but I remembered it and, wrote it down at the time because it really struck a chord with me to have the relationship with the breath articulated in that way as enhancement breathing and observation breathing. So I sometimes use her terms. I want to give credit to the person that sparked this whole thing for me, because I've really put a lot of thought into it over the years and really worked with this in my practice, as I'm suggesting in this episode. So in terms of the breath, sometimes we want to breathe deliberately and with purpose. When we're practicing pranayama or any kind of breathing technique, we are intentionally expanding, extending, deepening the breath, moving the breath into different locations, like different places in the ribs, the abdomen, the back body, or wherever, and using the breath to affect the body's energies or to impact the nervous system. The breath is an extremely powerful resource, and there are breath techniques for calming the system or cooling the emotions or uplifting our energy, clarifying a fuzzy mind, or more. There's lots of different ways that we can use the breath to affect some outcome. And most yoga students will be really familiar with this deliberate way of working with the breath. But there's also a more receptive and observational way of relating to the breath. The body naturally knows how to keep the breath going, even when we're not taking charge of it. So there are times when the breath can be the object of our attention without us changing and manipulating it. We could simply observe our breathing patterns, like in a breath inquiry practice. If you've ever worked with Donna Farhi's beautiful book, The Breathing Book, there are a lot of examples in that of these kind of breath inquiry and observation practices, which I highly recommend diving into. Or even in a more active pose, we can use observation mode to be curious about how the breath is showing up. Like say in a warrior two pose, you could be in that pose, but gleaning information about your effort level, or perhaps where the body is restricted in the shape just by noticing the breath and not even really changing it. And we can certainly rest in the organic rhythms of the breath rather than controlling the breath while we're in Shavasana. So we kind of move back and forth from observation mode to enhancement mode with our breath during most yoga practices. Mindfulness meditation, on the other hand, actually emphasizes the more receptive and observational way of being with the breath. So for those of us who practice both mindfulness meditation and yoga, this might be one of those areas you've kind of noticed the instructions are different, or they tend to be different. In this type of meditation, we are instructed to notice the breath or follow the breath, making it the anchor of our attention, but without altering its patterns. In mindfulness meditation, the breath is simply a link to the present moment. So it's a way of keeping the mind centered on what is happening here and now, which means it doesn't really matter if the breath is long or short or heavy or light or deep or shallow. We can observe all of these fluctuations of the breath and sense the truth of change and impermanence and be in the present moment with all of it. But we generally hold back from imposing our preferences or our expectations upon the breath in that kind of practice. And we learn to apply that to other domains, like being mindful of feelings and thoughts and just letting those be as well. So the breath is a really great teacher. Coming back to how we use the breath in yoga, weaving these together, many yogis actually learn to practice ujjayi breathing continuously throughout all of their asana, their postural practice. It's a way of regulating the breath and timing the movements and focusing the mind. And if you're not familiar, ujjayi is a slow, controlled breath with a slight constriction at the back of the throat, which makes the breath audible to the person who's doing it. Ideally not necessarily audible across the room, but sometimes it is. It's really not meant to be that strong. It's just something you can hear yourself doing. However, this habit can become so ingrained that for some practitioners, they'll still be doing ujjayi breath even in shavasana or when they're doing meditation. So speaking from my own experience, I can say, how challenging it can be to just be with the breath in meditation after so many years of deliberate breath enhancement practice. So it's not always easy to switch modes back and forth when we've developed a habit in one kind of practice and then we're kind of partaking of another kind of practice. So the skill of paying attention to how we're interacting with the breath is a key one for yoga practitioners who are exploring mindfulness. And since we often define mindfulness as non-judgmental awareness, or another way of saying that is it's a way of being aware of what's arising in the moment without fixing or changing it, this becomes a really important point. Like, how do we just be with the breath? And Yin Yoga, I have found, is a really great place to explore this because we can blur the boundaries between asana and meditation. So you can come into a yin pose and get comfortable enough to hold it for, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and experiment with these modes of attention using either the breath or the stretch sensations as your muse. To give a breath example, let's say you're doing a reclining twist. You could take 3 deliberate breaths into your rib cage in the side that's opening in the twist. That would be enhancement breathing. And it might make you more aware of the stretch. It might help you let go into the stretch. It might help free up your capacity to breathe into that side of the body. All really great benefits. And then after those 3 deliberate breaths you're taking, though, you could then shift to observational breathing and have the intention to shift modes and to just be curious. Where does the breath want to go? Maybe you'll find that the breath slows down or it gets more subtle. Or maybe you'll start to feel a little breath movement in your back or in your waist in some slightly unexpected way. Without really making anything happen, you can just watch the body breathing itself in that yin pose shape and just see how things evolve over a few minutes. And whenever the mind wanders, just like in meditation, you bring your attention back to that simple focal point of the body breathing. And you could toggle back and forth between that kind of observation mode and the more deliberate breathing enhancement mode as many times as you wanted to within one yin pose. But it's really interesting to just kind of know which mode you're in. So this distinction between a receptive approach and a deliberate approach can also apply to how we work in active yoga postures. There's always some element of intention in choosing a pose and arranging the body into that basic shape. But beyond that, there are degrees to which some practitioners strive to be directive in terms of the alignment or not as they are holding the pose. And we can look at technique and directive alignment instructions as coming from a more deliberate or enhancement mode of practice. Without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we can also begin to look for ways of cultivating the more receptive observation mode within asana. This could take the form of simply pausing before and after making an alignment adjustment to inquire, what am I feeling here before I adjust? And what effect did that adjustment seem to have? What sensations do I notice now? So noticing before and after we do make a change. So this inquiry alone can move us away from rote ways of practicing that may be based on dogmatic or aesthetic-based alignment teachings, or cues that might feel better in someone else's body than they do in your own. I believe that to mature in asana practice and to truly understand the poses, we have to be willing to dialogue with our own bodies and try things in different ways to start to trust what we feel. With practice, we may be able to hold space for the alignment of the pose to emerge more naturally. How we adjust could be based on observing the breath and slightly shifting to help the breath find more freedom. Or we could find organic adjustments to the posture based on the sensation feedback we're getting. Like if I rotate my leg this way, my low back releases. These are generally not cues that someone else can give us. Like maybe a teacher can suggest options as an educated guess about what the outcomes may be, but even a master teacher with an amazing knowledge of anatomy cannot feel what you are feeling. When we rely really heavily on the more deliberate or enhancement-based practices and approaches to asana, often the practice starts to feel a bit cerebral. We might be trying to work with too many technical details all at once, or find ourselves prioritizing the visual appearance of the pose too much. Many students fall into a pattern of trusting alignment cues as primary or even exclusive measures of safety within the pose, and many well-intentioned teachers and teacher trainers seem to encourage this as well. I can tell you from my experience that all of these factors contribute to losing the felt sense of connection with the body in asana practice. When my practice was at its most technical and alignment-based and it was really precise, I actually felt a lot less connected to my felt sense of the body. So I don't know, perhaps it's kind of a stage or an inevitable part of the process that many of us go through in learning the postures and in developing our relationship with them. However, I do think it's possible to get out of our heads and begin to trust the signals from the body as a guide for finding a safe and a balanced version of the pose. One might argue that prioritizing a more mindful awareness of the felt sense of the pose is actually safer, since we're more likely to feel any warning signals from the body. Rather than completely discarding this idea of alignment, we begin to see how the body could find alignment from the inside out. By observing the breath in a pose shape or noticing the location and intensity of sensations, we will find that the body knows how to adjust, just like the body knows how to breathe, and to find harmony. Circling back to meditation one more time, I will say that when we emphasize being with things in a non-interfering way in mindfulness practice, you will still find that these modes of observation and enhancement are also useful. We use both. And maybe enhancement is not the word we'd prefer here when we're talking about mindfulness meditation, but something more like deliberate or an active process of navigating the meditation. That's definitely part of the practice. We begin to discern more clearly when it would be useful to try a technique from our toolkit or to switch the kind of meditation we're doing in midstream and to guide our meditation more deliberately. Other times we find it's more helpful to step back and ask, what's here right now? To just observe and practice that kind of mindful curiosity. For example, if an emotion is present, sometimes we may be able to simply note it and hold it in awareness. Other times we need to meet it with some metta phrases or bring in a rain practice in order to relate to it with mindfulness. So I've given a few different examples here of ways that we sometimes want to work with a more deliberate process in different kinds of practice, active asana and meditation and breath practice, and other times where it's really helpful to step back and just be in that kind of mindful awareness observation mode in all these different domains of practice. Some of the domains of practice seem to emphasize one mode more than the other, but I think that all of them can be useful when we're aware of what we're doing and how we're using our attention. So I hope this was interesting to consider, this distinction between an observational mode of attention and a deliberate or enhancement mode. And perhaps you'll start to look for how you're switching back and forth between these in all the practices you do and start to play with that. And I think you'll find and learn and benefit from both ways. And as you play and practice with this, maybe you'll gain a greater sense of when each mode is useful. So I hope you have fun with it. And thank you for going with me on this journey of exploring the subtle aspects of practice. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend and/or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.